Yeah. Let's see if this works.
Okay.
All right. It says I'm live.
Okay, cool.
I'm
Good.
gonna refresh the page, see what happens.
Yeah.
All right, I'm here. I'm here.
Awesome, awesome.
Question is, can you
Oh, yeah,
hear
you're right.
me?
Yeah, here we go. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Testing one, two. You can hear me?
Yep, you're great.
All right, cool. All right, fantastic.
Awesome. Here we go.
All right, cool. All right, fantastic. All right, everybody. So, hi there. Welcome. I think this is working. Hopefully, let me test it out real quick. It might be on a delay. All right. Just give me a second. All right, everybody. So bear with me. I'm gonna try. This is something completely new. So this is Zoom. It's really weird talking to a computer screen. I'm going to imagine that there are a whole bunch of people in front of me. It is definitely very different being here virtually rather than being there in person. Wish I could be there in person, but just due to the circumstances, unfortunately, I can't be. I'm really excited to talk to all of you today about beach nesting birds. So this presentation is titled "Welcome Back, Birds," and it's going to be an introduction to the beach nesting birds that we have here. Before we get started, though, I just want to give a shout out to a whole bunch of different people. I want to say thank you to the Forgotten Coast Sea Turtle Center and the Florida Coastal Conservancy for hosting this event that we're having today. I'm really excited to be here, and this is exactly what needs to be going on for shorebird and wildlife conservation. Having presentations and talks like this where we can educate people, this is super important. And so we just want to say thank you for being advocates for the birds and giving us a space to talk about them. I would also like to say thank you to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. All of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today is made possible due to the funding from the NIFWIFs, grants that we receive. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Florida Shorebird Alliance up here. The Florida Shorebird Alliance is it's a statewide network of a whole bunch of different organizations that work together to make all of what I'm presenting to you today possible. All of the research, all of the information, all of the data, everything put together. There's a lot of things that happen with the Florida Shorebird Alliance, and there's a lot of people working together to make things happen, from private landowners to county offices to the law enforcement to tons of volunteers. We wouldn't be able to do all the work that we do without any of these people. Also, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, National Park Service, Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, and the state parks with Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Those are a lot of where our sites are, and having these protected lands allow us to help with shorebird conservation and be able to monitor and provide an area for these birds. So just thank you again, and yeah, let's get started. So before I get started, I just want a disclaimer. I know I don't have an audience in front of me, so it's hard to interact. I have my Facebook pulled up over here, so if you guys at any point, if I'm trying to do like an interactive thing, feel free to comment, and I'll try to see it as we're going, and I can answer questions, or if there's something that you thought was really cool, please let me know. Even if you just want to say ha ha, that is great too, because I enjoy the feedback, and I like to think that I'm funny. So there may be moments that I laugh at myself, or I may like imagine somebody's laughing. So yeah, really excited to get started here, and let's get to it. So we're going to start with, who is Ricky Cassell? Who is this guy presenting to you? I just want to give you a little bit about my background so that way you can know what's going on here and who's talking to you. So a little bit of background about myself. In 2018, I graduated from Florida Gulf Coast University down in Fort Myers, Florida. I was originally born and raised in Michigan my whole life, and wanted to try something different, and I thought FGC was a great spot to be. It's a very, very cool environmental area, not too far away from the Everglades, and the wildlife down there is incredible. So that is where I spent 4 years of my life, and after that, I took an internship at Cayo Costa State Park. Cayo Costa State Park is an island in Southwest Florida. It's not too far away from Fort Myers. And as an intern there, I primarily worked with the sea turtle program. So I have some knowledge on sea turtles. So this is actually a picture of me with my very first nest that I ever was able to find, and mark and do all the work for. Sea turtle volunteers, you guys all know about that. So Cayo Cassell working with sea turtles. I did that for a summer, and while I was there, there's a little line pointing to where Cayo Cassell is located. Beautiful barrier island, by the way. You should visit. But anyways, while I was there, I met a shorebird biologist who actually introduced me to the world of shorebirds. If you guys look right here, you can see me with some flagging tape and some twine, and there's a couple of posts laid out around the area. And right in the middle of this picture, I don't know if you can see it, I'm about to point it out. I'll give you a moment to see if you guys can see it. There is a shorebird that is actually in the middle of this posted area. Now, it's kind of hard to tell. It kind of blends in with the vegetation a little bit, and the shorebirds are very good at hiding and staying elusive and blending in with their surroundings. So I'm going to point it out. Right there is an American oyster catcher. That was the very first nest that I came across, and it was with the help of Britt Brown from FWC. She helped us find this nest as interns, and then we roped it off with her help. And so this was my first introduction to the world of shorebirds. So after my summer working with the sea turtles, I next went down to Fort Myers Beach, not too far away from Cayo Cassell. It's a couple barrier islands down just south of Sanibel. And while I was there, I was working as a shorebird biologist with FWC. My connection that I made with Britt at the Cayo Cassell State Park allowed me to go on and work on Fort Myers Beach with FWC. So right here is a picture of me with my very first shorebird nest at Fort Myers as a shorebird biologist, the one that I found on my own. And I'll give you guys a moment to see if you can find it. Again, it blends in very well. This is a Wilson's plover nest, which I'll be talking more about in just a moment. And so Wilson's plover nest is right there. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse on this screen, but I'm going to wave it around. There is one single egg right in between this vegetation right there, and that is from a Wilson plover, which we will talk about more in just a moment. Cool. So after my summer of shorebirds in 2019, the summer of 2020, I actually spent as an environmental educator up in Jekyll Island on the coast of Georgia. Beautiful area. They do have some shorebirds there. Only the Wilson's plover is really nesting on Jekyll Island. But it's another really cool spot, coastal system, very beautiful marshes, lots of birds for any bird enthusiast. Definitely recommend checking it out. Right here is a live oak that me and my friend Megan are sitting in, and it's the maritime forests there are incredible. Another great place to visit. And so there I was able to hone my skills as an environmental educator and really be able to talk about what we're seeing here in the in the environment. And so now, last but not least, I'm working as a shorebird biologist for Audubon Florida, and I started this past July and will be here for this breeding season. So a little bit more about where I am. I work primarily as the Tyndall Air Force Base shorebird biologist, which if you see these two yellow lines on the left side of the screen here, right in between there, that is all Tyndall Air Force Base beaches that I cover with FWC Britt Brown. And so we cover all of those areas from there. And then this little circle down here is Eglin Cape Sandblast, that property there. It's about 2 miles of beach. They own that little corner right there. And that is a beautiful area. And we'll actually be able to talk a little bit more about some of the nesting sites in Gulf County. So if you look up north here of Cape Sandblast, there's this long peninsula. I'm just going to point this out. I don't work there. This is covered by shorebird biologist from FWRI, the research institute with FWC. But that peninsula is where St. Joseph Peninsula State Park is located, and that is a super important park. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a little bit. So yeah, these are the sites I covered: Tyndall Air Force Base and Cape Sandblast. So before we get more into shorebirds, let's kind of talk about Audubon. Who is or what is Audubon Florida? So Audubon has a really cool history, and it's one of the very first, I think, conservation movements that we really had, probably in the world. So the plume trade here, there was a plume trade back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and when feathers were all the rave. Women, I believe, is specifically in Europe, it was very fashionable to have feathers, like these big, beautiful feathers, very, I guess, what's the way of wording it? Like these luscious, beautiful plumes, and you can see some of these plumes over here on this great egret. So they would take these plumes and they would actually put them in their hats, and actually thousands upon thousands, potentially, dare I say it, millions of birds were during that time around the world were actually harvested, poached and harvested for their feathers, for these plumes to be able to put them in their hats. The market for it was so crazy that 1 ounce of feathers, like weight for weight, was worth more than an ounce of gold, which is really crazy. So there was a big problem going on. I believe in other spots in the world, the populations of birds had gotten down so much that it wasn't really worth for the hunters to go, to the spots that they had been going to. So they started coming to the Florida Everglades, and they started taking out the wading bird populations down there. They, mainly the egrets and the herons, roseate spoonbills, those were all impacted by this plume trade. So people started noticing, and people were like, hey, something's not right here, like we're killing all these birds, and we're essentially, we're going to decimate their population. So there was a couple people that started a movement, and that was Harriet Hemingway and Minnie Hall. They were Boston socialites, and they started to take a stand. So they hosted these tea parties where they invited all of their friends, and they actually started talking to them, convincing them not to wear the hats with the plumes and the feathers. So that was the beginning of the movement. And in 1896, these two were actually able to create the Massachusetts Audubon Society, which was the very first start of the Audubon Society. And over the next few years, more and more states started to join that movement. They wanted to stand up for environment, and this was a great platform to do it. And with that, with all these states coming forward, now they're starting to get into the federal government, and the first national wildlife refuge at Pelican Island down in southeast Florida was actually created with the help of the different state Audubon societies. And by 1905, they established a national organization. And just one other big thing to note is that this group was also one of the strong pushers for the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which was established in 1918, and that is single-handedly one of the strongest laws that is protecting North American birds. So Audubon has been around for over 100 years. They play a super important role in conservation, and their impact and reach is phenomenal. And I'm actually going to show you this on a picture on this next map. So here is the nationwide influence of Audubon Florida. If you look at this, you can see Audubon's stretches they're in every state, whether it's state offices, sanctuaries, nature centers, Audubon chapters. They also have college chapters as well. So there's a lot of people getting involved with Audubon, and a lot of different things going on, working to do the best for birds. And I'll talk a little bit about this here. The mission statement of Audubon is to protect birds in the places they need today and tomorrow. So there's a bunch of different ways that they do this, right? So I need to refer to some notes real quick just to make sure I hit every single point. So birds are everywhere, and there are so many places where they live with other wildlife. And so protecting these places for the birds today and tomorrow is also protecting it for wildlife and other different species of life everywhere. So Audubon does this completes their mission. Let me go back to it real quick. They complete their mission through science, advocacy, education, on-the-ground conservation, and they believe in a world in which people and wildlife can both strive together. So the strategic priorities we have, there's a different facets to it. How are they going to accomplish this mission? They have the coast, the working lands, water, bird-friendly communities, and climate. So today we're actually going to focus on the coast, as I am a part of the Audubon Florida coastal team, and we're working on the coast, working with shorebirds. So to get into it a little bit, now we're going to start talking about shorebirds. So I want all of you to take a moment, whether you're watching this now or watching this in the future, because this is going to be on Facebook forever. I want you to imagine a bird nest. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of a bird nest? What goes into making a bird nest? I want you to just take a moment. You could write it down. You could list it out. You could even type it out on the comment section of the Facebook page. I'm looking at it right now. Feel free to tell me, what do you think a bird nest is? Imagine it. Okay? And what's the first thing that comes to your mind? I'll give you guys just a minute. All right. So for me, when I'm imagining a bird nest, the first thing that comes to my mind are sticks, twigs, maybe maybe a little bit of mud. You know, if you're thinking about a barn swallow, um, a whole bunch of different stuff together, making like this essentially like a ball of sticks. You know, when you think of a traditional bird nest, and where do you typically think of that bird nest being? I usually think of it being in a tree, right? And maybe maybe it's because I grew up in Michigan, or you know, I'm not as familiar with shore nesting birds, but uh, these shore nesting birds have definitely a very interesting nesting strategy. So here is a picture of a shorebird nest. Now, does that take a moment? Does that look anything like what you imagined it would look like? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. So first thing that comes to my mind is a bunch of sticks and twigs up in the tree. Whereas shorebirds, they nest on the beach. They put their nest right in the sand. They'll make what is called a scrape, or a slight indentation that you can see there. Imagine dropping like a tennis ball or a softball. It varies with the size of bird, but dropping that in the sand and then picking it up, that's essentially what a scrape looks like. You might see some feet marks in there as well. So they'll create these scrapes. Usually the males of the species will create them, and then they will try to woo the females with all their different scrapes. Some of them will actually decorate them with like sticks and twigs and shells like around the edges. But they tend to keep it really neat and like this nice, beautiful white sand. So yes, these birds nest right on the ground. They are ground nesters. If you look at this photo right here, this is actually a nest of a black skimmer. Again, you'll be able to see more pictures of these in just a second. But you can see if you look at the front left egg, there's a little bill poking out of a black skimmer. So as we were doing one of our surveys, we came across this nest as it was hatching. So took a photo, moved on really quickly, for the best for the birds. Anyways, so yeah, so this is what a shore nesting bird looks like. And so all the birds I'm about to share with you, this is essentially what they do. They put their nests right in the sand. And so with that being said, the reason why we're hosting this event today, thank you to the Sea Turtle Center, the Lovebirds and Shorebirds event, is that the shorebird breeding season is actually February 15th. So this upcoming Monday is the start of the breeding season. They have recorded some shorebirds nesting actually at this time, even I think a day or two earlier, as a couple years ago. Usually it's right around here though. So February 15th is the official start date, and we're going to be starting to post areas to help the birds and protect them, which I'll talk more about later. So moving on. So when talking about shore nesting birds, we're talking about a specific group. Their Latin order name is called Charadriformes. So Charadriformes is referring to our shore nesting birds. And shore nesting birds, we can kind of split up into two different groups. We've got shorebirds and we've got seabirds. For the most part, there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some differences. So I'm going to go through those really quickly. So shorebirds, as you know, their name would have it, they spend most of their time near the shore. Seabirds, they spend most of their life at sea. So there are actually some seabirds that they'll actually, they're living out in the ocean, and when they're resting or they're roosting, they're floating on top of the ocean. So it's really neat. Whereas shorebirds, they typically will nest on the beach, roost on the beach, and rest there pretty much all times of the day when they would like to. But seabirds, they're interesting lives because they spend a lot of time at sea. Anyways, so shorebirds, they forage or they feed by probing in the mud and sand or picking through the rack line. Seabirds, they forage by picking up fish from the sea. And I actually have a couple of photos of what their foraging strategies look like. So in the left photo here, we have a ruddy turnstone. This was one of the birds that Jana Reinhardt mentioned in her talk. I'm going to put a side note in here really quick. Jana, you did an awesome, fantastic job. It was a great presentation and talked about some really great things. I really loved how you brought in all the bird sounds, talking about while observing the birds, because the bird sounds actually play a super important role in being able to identify the birds sometimes, because sometimes you can hear them, whereas sometimes you can't see them. So it's super helpful in identifying birds. So shorebirds, yeah, so we've got the ruddy turnstone. Here he's picking through the rack line. For those of you who don't know, the rack line is that line of debris that gets washed up with each high tide or as the waves are coming up. They'll drop off some different sticks, shells, especially after a big storm. Sometimes you'll have like a whole bunch of like marsh grass wash up. And so that is the rack line. So here's a ruddy turnstone picking through. It looks like he's either got a worm or some sort of crustacean that he pulled out of its shell. So picking through the rack line on the beach. Whereas seabirds, they catch their food by diving down into the water, crashing into the water, and catching their fish with their feet and pulling it up and then carrying it away. I guess it depends on the species. Some will catch it with their feet, some will catch it with their bill. But the least terns are really cool. They're fun to watch. They'll actually like hover above a spot. They're looking down. You can see that they're observing where the fish are, and then they'll make this crazy dive right into the water, and it makes a really cool ripple effect, as you can see with this photo. So yeah, observing birds is a blast, and these are two great examples of foraging shorebirds. So next, shorebirds tend to be what we call solitary nesters. So solitary nesters, if you had to take a guess, what do you think it means? Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, so solitary nesters tend to nest by themselves, whereas colonial nesters, the opposite, they nest in large groups. Now, there's different strategies to doing it these two different ways. So solitary nesters, or let me show you an image real quick. So here we have a snowy plover in the front here, in the kind of in the grassy area. So that is kind of an example of a solitary nester. They're by itself. There's not really much else going on around, and their whole focus with solitary nesting is to go unnoticed. They want to be super sly and hidden. They don't want to be seen at all. So that's kind of why they stay by themselves. And as we see more photos of snowy plovers, you'll notice that they're the color of sand. So they blend in really well, and their camouflage does a good job. So that's their strategy. Now, in the back of this photo, behind the snowy plover, you'll see a bunch of darker figures with a little bit of orange and white. Those are black skimmers. So not a great photo because it's not in focus right now, but it tells the story of them being colonial nesters. So they'll actually hang out in a group. It could be up to 300, 500 birds in a group. Not all of them may be nesting, but a good chunk of them could be nesting. And so they have colonial nesting as a strategy, as it is, it provides them strength in numbers. So by having more birds, predators are less likely to try to, snatch one of their eggs or one of their chicks, because they have all of these different birds essentially trying to chase them off. Now this is really cool. So the chicks of the shorebirds and the seabirds are different, and it's in the way that they behave immediately from day one. So with shorebirds, the chicks are semi-precocial. And what that means is that as soon as they're born, when they hatch, as soon as these chicks hatch, within an hour, maybe up to 4 hours, these birds are up, ready to go, and on the move, and they'll actually start foraging on their own. Kind of similar to like when a horse is born, or when like a zebra or some sort of like a deer, something that has to be able to get up and run, to be able to run away from predators. Kind of the same idea. As soon as they hatch out of their egg, they're pretty much ready to go. Now with seabirds, they're kind of the opposite. They're like those the teenager that never leaves, right? They depend upon their parents the whole time as their chicks. And even after they fledge, they'll keep begging for food for a while. And so we call that altricial. And here's actually some photos of what their chicks look like. So if you see in the left photo here, that is a snowy plover chick that is, this one's probably at least a week old. But even then, after 4 hours of hatching from their egg, they're on their feet running like this. And it's really fun to watch them because they'll run, they'll pick up an insect, they'll eat it, they'll stop, they'll scan, look for the next one. And they'll keep doing this, and it's really fascinating to watch. Now seabirds, on the other hand, in the right photo here, we've got black skimmer chicks. They just kind of lay in their little scrape that they've made or that their parents made for them, and just kind of hang out there, just waiting, until their parent brings a fish to them. So they just kind of hang out, and they don't really do much during the day. They just kind of rely on the parents, which I'm sure all of us can kind of relate. I know I can. So yes, next. So some examples of shorebirds, which I'll share in just a moment. We've got American oyster catchers, snowy plovers, Wilson's plovers, and for seabirds, we've got black skimmers and least terns. So in the state of Florida, we've got about 20 species of nesting seabirds and shorebirds. Of those 20 species, there's 5 that we really take notice to and prioritize. And those are what we call the focal species. So we've got 5 focal species, which I'm going to run through now, and these birds have a more of a focus on them because their numbers have declined so much that they're potentially they're listed as threatened and potentially on their way to being endangered, which then could go to extinction if we don't take the efforts to try to reverse that. So 4 of the species that are our focal species are state listed as threatened. And 1 of the species is under review. They are of greatest conservation need, which means their population has declined quite a bit, but we don't really have enough information to be able to fully establish them as being state listed. So the first species that we have here is the American oyster catcher. Jana talked about this one in her presentation as well, and they have a really cool sound that she played. So if you guys get a chance, go back and watch Jana's presentation because she had some awesome information. So the oyster catchers, yeah, they're very noisy on the beach if you happen to startle one or if you're nearby when you hear one. But they get their name primarily for the food that they eat. So oyster catchers, what do they eat? They eat oysters. And so you might wonder a little bit more about that. Well, how do the oyster catchers, how do they eat the oysters? How does that work? Well, they have to be quick and fast because oysters, they can move and swim away really quickly. I hope somebody's laughing out there because oysters are actually, they stay in one place. We call them sessile. They don't move at all. The only ability that they have to move is to close their abductor muscle, which allows them to open themselves and close. And so oyster catchers, they don't. It's kind of tricky for what they have to do. I mean, they've got it down to a science. This is what they're known for. So if any of you have ever shucked oysters before, you kind of know how difficult it is to open an oyster. You really have to wedge, like the utensil in there and then pry it open, and then that's a lot of work. Well, what the oyster catchers do is they actually wait for a tide, the tide to come in to just cover the oysters a little bit. And so the oysters are filter feeders, and as the water comes over the oyster beds that they're on, they'll actually start to open up, and so that way they can filter feed, because that's how oysters feed. And so when that starts to happen, the oyster catchers will kind of they'll come in and they'll actually jam their bill into the oyster. They'll sever that abductor muscle, and then they'll take the oyster out and eat it. Now there's different methods to doing this. There's probing, where they'll kind of just like jab at it. Sometimes they'll actually hammer on the shell. Other times they'll just stick it in there and just rip it right out. So different strategies, and they've actually found that oyster catchers, with the different methods of eating, how they consume the oysters, it actually kind of changes their bill shape a little bit. Whether it would be more sharp or more kind of a blunt edge. Yeah, so now if there aren't enough oysters around, I meant to fix this on my PowerPoint. It says shellfish, but what I really mean is other bivalves. So other things that open up in half, so like clams, scallops, coquina shells, that kind of stuff. So yeah, the oyster catcher, fantastic. The next thing I'm going to talk about is kind of their breeding season. So they breed from March through September, and their average clutch size is about 3 eggs, and their incubation period, or the days that it takes to hatch, is about 27 to 29 days. So once they hatch, this is what you get. You have a couple little teeny tiny guys hanging out with the adult. So now with most of these species, or actually all of these species, the chicks will remain with the parents for a while. And oyster catchers are actually a little bit different than other shorebirds. And what they found is that the oyster catcher chicks will actually, they rely on their parents until even after they fledge. So the parents will actually help them feed for most of their life, which is really, oh goodness, not most of their life, for the first 2 months of their life. So continuing on, here is the next stage of an oyster catcher. This is kind of like the oyster catcher teenage, not teenage years, a couple days or a week. So the oyster catcher chick here it's not quite to the fledgling status yet, but it's definitely bigger than the chicks that I showed you in the last picture. And you can kind of see it's getting a little bit more of its feathers. Its bill is getting a little bit longer. And here it's with an adult foraging. So here, this guy kind of looks different, and that's because he's made it to that fledgling stage. You can kind of see he's got some weird feather patterns going on around his neck. But what's also really noticeable is that the tip of his bill is black. And so that is a sure sign to say, like, hey, that's a juvenile. They'll actually have that, like the black on their bill for their first 3 years of life. And once they, are entering into their 4th year, that's when they'll get like that, that bright orange color, and then the bright orange eye ring around their eye, which we'll go back. You can see that there on this photo. So the American oyster catcher, what's really cool here, Florida Shorebird Alliance shout out. They created these maps with the data that we've been collecting over the past 10-15 years to show you where American oyster catchers are nesting and breeding. And so the main spots for the oyster catchers is actually there's one site in the Panhandle. It's St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. There's a good population, breeding population there. And there's another breeding population just south of Cedar Key. You'll see it's in Citrus County, just at the south end of the Big Bend. And then the most productive site that I recently learned is over here towards St. Augustine on the east side of the state. That's the most productive site, meaning that these are most of the chicks that actually make it to fledgling and continue on. Perfect. All right, so yeah, so go ahead and enjoy that for another moment. All right, so next we're going to talk about the least tern. So the least tern is a seabird that nests here in the state of Florida. So they're also state listed as threatened, and their diet is mostly small bait fish. And what's kind of cool with the small bait fish that they catch, I showed you that picture earlier of the bird that had dove into the water. It was, looking for small bait fish. Here's an example of a least tern with a small bait fish. So during the breeding season, once these birds catch these bait fish, they'll actually try to show it off to the female, like, hey, look what I caught, and actually present it to her. And then the female can decide whether or not to accept it or not, or say, hey, yeah, go somewhere else. And this is the beginning of the courtship ritual, essentially, of what they have. So the male will present this fish, the female can choose to accept it. If she does accept it, then that means they're gonna start nesting behavior. The female will, after the scrape is created, she'll start laying eggs, and then they'll start incubating, and the male will continue to catch fish and bring them back to the female. So a little bit more about that. They're mostly nesting from April to September. Their average clutch size is about 3 eggs, and days to hatch is about 27 to 29 days. And so here's an example of the eggs. So again, with nesting on the beach, if you look at this photo, you can see how well the eggs really blend in with the sand and all of the other different debris that's in the sand. So again, shorebirds, one of their greatest advantages is being camouflage, but that's also a disadvantage when it comes to people walking on the beach potentially, because they're very hard to see. So this is a really good example of just how well they could potentially blend in. And so after their eggs hatch, this is what you see. So here's a least tern family with a couple of young chicks. These chicks are probably maybe a week old. You can just see they're teeny tiny and they're fluffy. For the most part, they're altricial. That was that term that I used earlier, where they rely on the parents to bring them food. And every once in a while, they'll kind of wander a little bit, and then they'll sit down and they'll just wait, and then their parents will come and find them and bring them the food. And so this is kind of an example of, can you guys spot the shorebird here? They blend in really well with their sand, like the sand, and this is essentially like the size of a blade of grass. They're hiding underneath that. So it's definitely very easy to not know that these birds are on your beach, or any of these chicks are on your beach, because of how well they blend in and how they like to hide. So that's just some food for thought there. These birds do a really amazing job of trying to go unnoticed, essentially, and it helps them with predators. And if a predator were to come into an area, or if there were people that were walking by who the birds think might be predators, the terns and the black skimmers, they actually have the strategy, because they're colonial nesters, of actually coming out in these massive groups and not massive groups, like one bird will come and then another will come and then another will come, essentially trying to deter you to get away from, their chick or their nest. So here's another photo of a chick that's even a little bit older. I mean, wow, look at that. Look how well that is blending in with the sand. That is incredible. I still can't get over it. I took this photo when I was working down in Fort Myers Beach in Southwest Florida. And I mean, with the fluffy sand, this least tern chick just really blends in really well. So really fascinating. I mean, that is, I mean, it's a great method to stay away from predators, to hide, and it works. I mean, it's one of those things is, if you're on the beach, you wouldn't really notice that they're there unless if there, was a huge group of birds and the adults were telling you, hey, my chicks and nests are here. Or if you saw a posted area, like sign postings, or if you were to just accidentally walk. Sometimes these chicks wander outside of the posted areas, and so sometimes you won't see them until you're like looking down right at them, like, oh, there's a bird there. So again, just really fascinating and amazing, just what these guys do to survive. Camouflage is the super helpful for these birds. So after about 19 to 20 days, I think this is the shortest fledgling time for the focal species in Florida. 19 to 20 days. The least terns, they're relatively quick in terms of getting ready to fledge. And so one thing I also wanted to point out is that in Florida, it's also really hot. I remember there was some days down in Southwest Florida where, the temperature was like 100, but the feels like was like 120. So oftentimes these chicks seek shade and shelter. A lot of times, people don't really like having vegetation on their beaches, but this vegetation can actually be super important and helpful for these birds and their survival, because they can hide in these plants and stay relatively out of the sun. Now, something else that, let's say people didn't want, this is where the Florida Shorebird Alliance comes into play, and, working with our partnerships to make sure that everybody involved is happy. We've started making efforts to create these things called chick shelters. So it's essentially like a little teeny tiny A-frame. It's not much bigger than what I'm doing with my hands here. And you can see it right there. It's literally a shelter from the sun, and this can actually help the chicks stay out of the sun. And it's a good way to provide shade for them without, allowing like tons of grass to grow. So yeah, no, this is, if anybody ever wants to volunteer and help us build chick shelters, we can always use more chick shelters. And you can be helping in conservation. So next bird, where least terns breed. So there's a very good population of least terns down in Southwest Florida. But we also do have a very high concentration in Bay County, which my mouse isn't hovering over it, but Bay County is the 5th county in along the coast. There's that dark green color right next to Gulf County. And then Franklin County, further to the east, also has a high concentration of least tern nesting behavior going on there. And so I want you to pay close attention to kind of those 3 counties. We've got Bay County, Gulf County, and Franklin County all in a row, just as we go through the next few species, because this area of Florida plays a super important role for our beach nesting birds. And so you can see right now for least terns, it's a very good area to be. This is where their nesting occurs. All right, so on to the next species. We've got the black skimmer. Now, black skimmer, don't tell any of the other species, but I think the black skimmer is probably one of my favorites. It's my favorite seabird, at least. Just the sounds that they make on the beach, and just look at them. They look so cool. One thing I definitely want to point out is their bill shape. If you look at their bill shape, you'll notice the longer bill, which is what we call, it's the lower part, it's the lower mandible, and then the upper part of the bill is the upper mandible. But that lower part is it's super long. It's a lot more long than the bill on top. And so they use this in their feeding strategy or their foraging behavior to catch small fish or bait fish. And so I actually have a photo of a skimmer skimming, hence where the name comes from, right here. So here is a black skimmer. This is in Southwest Florida, skimming across the water, essentially catching fish. And so they'll imagine if you were to take your fingers like this, kind of like a peace sign, turn it sideways, and you had this bottom one in the water. They'll go, and until they hit like a fish, and then as soon as they hit a fish, it snaps shut, and they pinch the fish between the two parts of their bill. And so as they're doing that, they leave like this really cool rippled trail in the water, and it makes the coolest noise ever. If you've ever had like a really good tear of like a piece of paper, if you tear it in half really fast, that's kind of what that sound sounds like as they're skimming across the water. So really cool feeding strategy, and I think that's probably why they're one of my favorites, just because it's kind of unusual amongst other birds. The skimmers are very unique in this way, and so here's an example of a fish that a skimmer caught. This one was looked like a little too big for it to chew. And so that is actually a pompano right there. You can kind of see his eye, and he's got that yellow, I believe it's a pelvic fin. And that's kind of a giveaway for the pompanos. And so it caught this big fish, and it was a little bit too big. So what they actually do is they mash it in between their bill until they get to a size where they can swallow it. And typically they'll swallow it head first, so that way none of the fins will actually jab into their throat as it's going down the hatch. And it was really fun. If you ever are on the beach and have a moment, take some time to observe these birds and watch them feed, because it is truly fascinating. So now here's another example of a fish that they caught. So this is a needlefish, or it's a small bait fish. And so the parents brought this fish back for one of its chicks. And so this is another, kind of talking about that altricial feeding again. So this is, the chicks are dependent upon their parents to bring them food. So this black skimmer brought this little chick this huge fish, and boy, I tell you, you wouldn't think that a small bird would be able to eat a big fish like that, but let me tell you, it swallows it whole, and it's amazing. Now you might wonder, after these birds swallow these fish whole, what kind of, do they digest the scales, or what do they do with them? Well, they don't necessarily digest. Everything else digests, but the scales, they'll actually essentially cough back up, similar to an owl pellet, except this is a fish scale pellet from a black skimmer. So it'll be just like a pile of scales, and it's pretty flaky and flimsy, so usually you wouldn't see them on the beach. But if you ever do come across something that looks like a pile of scales all together, that's from a bird regurgitating it like a pellet, an owl pellet. So black skimmers, needlefish, I can't believe they can eat all that. So the average, black skimmers, they're kind of later in the season. They start nesting around May, and then they're kind of the last ones to finish up as well in September. So the average clutch size for the black skimmers is about 4 eggs. The days to hatch, 21 to 25 days, and then they're flight capable after 23 to 26 days. And so here's another picture of a skimmer with a slightly older chick than the one I first showed you. So this one's probably about 2 weeks old. This was in the same location as that other photo with the small downy chick. And again, just please notice the mandible on the black skimmer here. So just see how much further it comes out than the top one. And also, I mean, you can see it here. It's super narrow too. So very efficient for skimming through the water. These birds were designed to skim, which is really cool. And here's an example of a slightly older chick in the front there. There's 2 adults behind it. So that older chick, that is probably fledged. They've got the fully formed tail feathers, and then they've got that mottled color, which they'll keep that mottled feathering color of like the black and white for at least their first year. And I think as they come into their next season, that's when they should start getting the darker feathers, and they become all black. And you also notice one of these adults has a band on its leg. I'll talk more about banding in a little bit, but banding is one of our tools for monitoring and assessing the populations of these birds. Cool. So here are here's the range map for the black skimmers for where they breed in the state of Florida. So again, if you look at our Tri-County area, the Bay County, Gulf County, Franklin County up in the Panhandle, you'll notice that there's a very high abundance in Franklin County, and there's a little bit of nesting going on in Bay and Gulf. So it's still a very important area, and there's lots of opportunities for black skimmers to nest here. Definitely really fun to watch, again, if you ever get the chance to see black skimmers while you're out on the beach. One thing that I forgot to mention is that black skimmers are also mainly nocturnal. So they mainly feed either... I guess you could call them crepuscular as well. In the evening, sometimes during the night, and then like super early morning, like before the sun rises. They're out foraging. So another important note here is that because they're nocturnal, they're spending their energy at night. So that means they're resting during the day. If you see these birds on the beach, make sure to give them space because they need all of that rest that they can get to be able to forage and feed their families, to be able to really be successful and happy, healthy birds. All right, so our next bird is the Wilson's plover. So the Wilson's plover, this is unlike the other 4 species that I'm sharing with you because this bird is not state listed as threatened. This is a species of greatest conservation need. And so what that means is that they haven't fully assessed the population of the Wilson's plover. They don't exactly know what the status of their population size is, but they have noticed a decline in the number. So they're not quite state listed yet as threatened, but it could potentially happen soon. So this bird is interesting because their diet is mainly crustaceans. And if you look at the bill right here, the bill of the Wilson's plover, you'll notice how it's really thick, it's really stout, it's kind of long. That is perfect for crunching on crustaceans. And an example of that is a fiddler crab. So next photo here. Here's a Wilson's plover with a fiddler crab. And the Wilson's plover, they don't hold back. So I felt really bad for this fiddler crab, but it's also kind of cool to watch. It's like, oh, yeah, circle of life. The Wilson's plover, it picked up this fiddler crab and just kept throwing it against the ground for a while. It was probably like 10 minutes I was watching it do this. And then eventually it just kind of like took its bill and just, smashed open the crab and then, ate the crab meat essentially. So crustaceans are their thing, and definitely pay attention to the snowy plover that I showed you because the bill shape and size is very different from that of the Wilson's plover. They're so much fun to watch. They have a lot of personality. These birds are also very vocal. So if you come near one of their nests, they will let you know that they don't want you there and that there's they want to try to send you somewhere else. So. While being on the beach, definitely pay attention to, what you see and also what you hear. These birds are very vocal and will let you know that they don't want you there. These birds will also actually, I don't want to say gang up. That's not quite the right term, but there will be groups of them that will, if there's a predator or a person walking near one of their nests or their chicks, they'll band together and they'll kind of pop up out of behind plants and whatnot and tell you like, hey, we don't want you here. So their average clutch size is about 3 eggs. So here's a photo of a Wilson's plover female with 3 eggs. You can tell the difference between the males and the female. The females have don't have a dark band right here around their neck, whereas the males do. It almost kind of looks like a bow tie. So the Wilson's plovers tend to nest higher up on the beach in the sand dunes. So typically there's vegetation all around. You can see this one's well in the vegetation. They're up higher on the beach. And another note about Wilson's plovers is that this is actually a species, Jana Reinhardt mentioned it, that nests on Eglin Cape sandblast. So you will very likely see them there if you're ever to go walk the beach at Eglin Cape sandblast. And they're so much fun to watch if you ever get the chance. So the days to hatch is about 23 to 29 days. And so here is an example of a Wilson's plover nest that is hatching. I happened to come across this nest just as it was hatching. As soon as the chicks hatch, they are kind of wet and slimy. They kind of look really funny, but within the hour, the Florida sun dries them out. Their feathers are dry, and so they get really poofy and fluffy. And in the next couple hours, they're up on their feet running. And let's see, does anybody remember what that term is called? Where the plovers are able to run and forage on their own? Well, if you said semi-precocial, you are correct. All right, perfect. So so these are newly hatched Wilson's plovers. Very cool, right? So this is a Wilson's plover chick that's a little bit older. This is probably somewhere between a week and 2 weeks. You can kind of see it's very fluffy. He's got these really long legs, and this guy right here is out fully foraging on his own. The parents are still around, making sure that predators are staying away. But for the most part, these birds are running up and down the beach, down to the water, back up to the dunes, running behind vegetation, hiding. Sometimes they'll actually hunker down underneath the vegetation or in the rack line. They have this perfect camouflage that blends right in. So it's super important to be aware that they're out on our beaches because, as people are walking, people are driving, it's very easy to potentially not notice these guys and potentially, harm them. So Wilson's plovers, so much fun. So after a couple weeks, this is the thing with all plovers, they get into this really awkward teenage stage. As you can see with this Wilson's plover, it's got a really funny, like a black collar almost. That's its like bare skin right there, and it just looks really goofy. And they're in this weird teenage stage for about a week or two, and then once they're to fledgling status, they're starting to get more feathers in and start looking more like an adult. And so here's an example of a fledged Wilson's plover. So where Wilson's plovers breed, for the most part, there's a good bit in Southwest Florida. There, if you look at our Tri-County area between Bay, Gulf, and Franklin, there's a good bit. But a majority of their nesting in the state of Florida is actually in the Northeast, towards Jacksonville, in that area of the state. And Wilson's plovers, the Florida holds 12% of their whole population. So you'll also see them nesting up in Georgia. I'm not entirely sure how far north they go. But Florida is an important spot for them, and we're trying to collect as much data as we can to learn more about them. All right, and last but not least, the snowy plover. So the snowy plover, it's state listed as threatened. This is a bird that is very common on our I say common. It's common on our beaches, but it's also still kind of a hard bird to come by. So their diet consists of small invertebrates. So they mainly feed on insects as well as worms, and here is a photo of a snowy plover in a tidal flat pulling out a worm out of the sand. So they're pretty vicious and relentless when it comes to foraging. They're really fun to watch. Their breeding season is March through September, although some of them do start right at the beginning in February. Their average clutch size is about 3 eggs, and their days to hatch is about 27 to 29 days. So snowy plovers, they like to nest kind of right in the middle of the open white sandy beaches. If you look at the color of them, they blend right in with the color of the sand. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. Yeah, so you could be walking on the beach and come across a snowy plover. And so here you can see a teeny tiny chick that had just hatched earlier, just moments ago. And after a couple hours, they get all fluffy and they're starting to go out on their own. So here's a photo of a snowy plover family. Typically, the chicks will tend to stay with the adults for a good bit until they reach their fledgling stage, and then after that, after they fledge, they tend to disperse and fly to other areas. And so here's a slightly older chick in the rack line foraging. Again, if you look at the color of the rack line, look at the color of the feathers, these birds blend in really well, so very easy to miss them. And I would say this one's probably in its awkward teenage phase. It looks a little bit goofy with the patchiness of the feathers. All right, and then the fledgling stage, flight capable, after about 35 to 45 days, the birds are able to fledge. And here's an example of a fledgling snowy plover. So you can see that it looks like the tail feathers have come in a little bit, not as much goofiness around the neck, but this is a good example of a fledge. All right, and now the snowy plovers, I saved this one for last because they have a really unique kind of story with where they breed. So a fun fact about snowy plovers is that 83% of the Florida population, like breeding pairs, are found in the Panhandle. And of that 83%, 20% of the whole population is found in the Gulf Islands National Seashore out towards Pensacola on the far western end of the Panhandle. And then the rest of that, what I guess would be about 63%, 60%, is kind of scattered throughout Bay County, Gulf County, and Franklin County. And Gulf County is a super important place for snowy plovers. So if any of you have ever been to St. Joseph Peninsula State Park, it was that state park that I mentioned right at the beginning of kind of the areas that I worked. I mentioned it in that a little bit that that peninsula actually has 10% of the snowy plover breeding population, and so that is a super important area. They actually call that area the Snowy Plover Factory. If you want to learn more about the Snowy Plover Factory, you can actually YouTube the video. I know the Sea Turtle Center is actually going to be playing it today. So definitely check that out because that is a super important site. So Gulf County is very important for snowy plovers, as well as many of the other species that I've talked about. And so many of you might be curious of seeing the timing of ground nesting birds and flightless chicks. So I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but the breeding season is from February 15th all the way to about end of August. September 15th is what they have listed here. And so this gives you an idea of some of the different species that nest. And so if you look at it, I'd like to point out snowy plover. Snowy plovers start in February, and then everything else kind of doesn't really start until March. That's when the American oyster catchers start thinking about it. Then the Wilson's plovers, and then least terns are about end of March, more so April, and then the black skimmers are later April, early May. And so this graph provided by the Florida Shorebird Alliance does a really good job of displaying that. So talk about all of these different shorebirds. And so what is the importance of studying these shorebirds and seabirds? Well, by having all of these monitoring efforts going on, we can get an idea of how to manage these species and to essentially what are their conservation needs? What do we need to do to essentially take care of them, get their population numbers back up? Because once they're gone forever, and all of these species play a different role in the environment, keeping it balanced. So these species of shorebirds, seabirds, a lot of different things you can look at are essentially environmental indicators. They tell you what the quality of the environment is looking like. So if you notice that the species of shorebirds are going down, it's like, well, maybe there's something going on in the environment. What is going on here? So they can really tell you a lot about just the quality of the environment that you're around, and it's super helpful. So there's been a decline in a lot of species numbers, and before the early 2000s, we didn't really start collecting a whole lot of data, so we didn't really know what was going on with these birds. So now we're starting to get baseline values and have about 15 to 20 years of data collected. So the more that we can learn about these birds, the more that we can help them. So there are lots of threats to shorebird populations. They're having a decline in suitable habitat. They're due to development. These birds like to be at places where a lot of people like to be. There's also sea level rise. That's going to be a challenge for them as sea levels get higher. Their beaches are essentially going to shrink. There's been an increase in predation going along with the development. Where there's more people, you're going to have more types of predators moving into these areas as well. There's also disturbances just by walking, dogs, vehicles. And birds use a lot of energy to run and fly away. And if birds are away from their nest for too long, the hot sun can actually cook the eggs. So you want to make sure that you're being aware of what's going on out on the beaches to best help the birds. And I haven't talked about these much, these two birds here to the right. On top, we have the red knot, and on the bottom, we have a piping plover. Jana mentioned these in her presentation as well. So these are federally listed birds, and they're kind of the conservation stories of shorebirds right now, because these are the ones in greatest need of for help. So another thing that doesn't really go for the birds is they hide so well. Most people don't know they're there, and if you don't know they're there, how are you gonna be able to help them? Because you don't know they're there, you don't know they exist. It's a bit challenging to really put efforts towards these birds to help them out. So for fun, I want you guys, how many birds do you see? Take a moment, try to count as many birds as you can, and let me know. Go ahead, comment it on Facebook. I don't know if I'll see it. I think there's a lag. But yeah, take a moment, see how many birds there are. I'll point them out in just a moment. All right. If you guys found not one, not two, but 3 birds, You got it. So these are all snowy plovers that are hiding. Again, these birds, they'll be right in the middle of the beach, right in front of you. You won't have any idea they're there. That's the way they like it. That's what they're trying to do. Their best defense is going unnoticed, camouflage. And so I have one more photo of snowy plovers. See how many you can find in this photo. All right, and if you found not one but two birds, you got them all. Perfect. So we talked about the threats. Now I'm just going to briefly mention some of the efforts that are out there to protect the beach nesting birds. So we do continuous monitoring all around the state. There's banding projects, so that's where researchers band the birds. It's essentially like a name tag. So as these birds fly around to different areas, people can report them, and we can learn more about these birds by the areas that they go to. But it only works as well as there's researchers or volunteers and people out looking for these birds. We also put up protective fencing. You can kind of see in the background of this photo, there's some twine. That's the beaches in Gulf County, Bay County, all around the state of Florida. You'll see protective fencing. Those are to protect the bird areas to, essentially to give the birds their space. And here's another example of posting that we would put out there. There's the bird crossing. It's really funny because the least terns are using this as an area to stay shaded, but it was a perfect opportunity to take a photo. Outreach and education, displays, presentations, and walks. This is super important to our mission. A lot of people, again, don't really know about these birds. I had no idea they existed until 3 years ago. So by having this outreach and education, more people can learn about the birds and join their side. Partnerships are super important. I mentioned the Florida Shorebird Alliance earlier. That's really what makes all this work happen, is all of the different people working together. We have established protected areas and predation management to help it helps help the shorebirds in the best way that we can to minimize predation. So there's a bunch of different ways you guys can help beach nesting birds. For one, you can respect signs in posted areas. If you see signs in posted areas, we really encourage you to read the signs. We put them out there to be read, and it is there. It's there to help the birds. If you guys see resting birds on the beach, please give them space. Again, like I said, those birds are resting for a reason. A lot of them go on long migratory journeys. And travel super long distances, and some forage during the night. Some have to feed their chicks. So it's really good to make sure you give them as much space when you can. Learning about the birds is also super great. What you're doing right now, watching this presentation, because once you learn about the birds, you can go ahead and share your knowledge and educate others. Also, please avoid littering and feeding wildlife. I like the principles of leave no trace. When there's like food and other things on the beach, some of the gulls like to go in and eat that, and they kind of become a nuisance problem. And then, if there's chicks in the area, the gulls will actually go and eat the chicks. So please, keep our beaches clean. Know your local beach rules, whether or not dogs are allowed. If they, need to be leashed. Please drive slowly if it's applicable to the beach that you're at. And one last thing to mention, you can volunteer and become a bird steward with Audubon Florida. So stewardship is super important with this whole conservation effort of shore nesting birds. Stewards are out there to educate beachgoers about the birds, provide information about what the birds are doing and why, kind of like what I'm talking about here. They explain the issues facing these birds, and they teach people how to identify the birds that are present on the beach. So if you ever want to become a steward, please reach out to Audubon Florida. You can reach out to me at richard.cassell@audubon.org. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I will stick around for a few minutes here to answer any questions. If anybody present right now has any questions, I can answer them. I will also be back on at 4 o'clock Eastern time, which is in about 50 minutes. So giving the same exact presentation again. I just want to say thank you all for your time, and thank you for listening. And I hope you enjoyed it and laughed a couple times and learned a lot about birds. Again, if you learned a really cool, exciting fact, please let me know in the comments on the Forgotten Coast Sea Turtle page. I'd love to hear your feedback, and thank you for your time. Oh, wow. I think there's a lot of comments potentially. Sorry, trying to figure this out. Let's see. All right, everybody. At the moment, I'm not seeing any questions. If I do find some in the meantime, I will be sure to mention or answer them in my next presentation. Or comment below. So thank you very much again for your time, and I hope you guys enjoy the Lovebirds and Shorebirds event. Thanks.